Glad to have you back. Well, as the global shift towards cleaner energy sources continues to gain attention, the role of energy transition becomes even more significant. Despite government's commitment to ramping up gas production and utilization, Nigeria's energy access is faced with limitations, with only about half of its population having reliable access to energy. According to experts, not only must Nigeria increase its gas output to meet domestic needs, it must also ensure that the necessary infrastructure is in place to distribute this energy effectively. But for more on this, I'm being joined by a senior officer with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Tengi George Ikoli. It's been a while, Tengi. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Yes, it has. Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, I think we need to start with all of these moves before now with regards to Nigeria's gas expansion. For me and the knowledge I have of this, there's been a time we had the gas monitoring plan. At the time, we also had the national gas policy. And the one that everyone would remember again, the recent one, Decade of Gas. All of this is to harmonize, take advantage of this resource. But what do you make of efforts by government first before we move into other specifics around this conversation?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that's the right place to start. Nigeria has, at different points, claimed, you hear the rhetoric that Nigeria is more of a gas country than an oil country. And we've had different plans and policies in place to try to harness that resource. But unfortunately, you cannot see the commensurate development on ground. And that raises the question, are our plans realistic? You know, we have the gas master plan in 2008. We had the national gas policy again in 2017. And now we have the decade of gas plan that's supposed to run from 2021 to 2030. But in those plans, the context has changed. When we first put out those plans in 2008, gas was booming, everyone needed gas in Nigeria and globally. The market was very hot. But now we have a context where governments have committed to reducing emissions globally to avert climate change and are defunding fossil fuel projects, of which gas is one. So the context has changed. We cannot now have the same ambitions that we had before because we also don't have the revenues to cash out and to exploit that resource the way that we would want to. So that's sort of the context that I wanted to lay first. But thank you for that question.
That would also be so interesting to you. But what's been the issue with regulatory and, of course, when you talk about, is that a regulatory and legal functions with regards to gas commercialization in Nigeria?
So the gas commercialization is an offshoot, an attempt to commercialize gas flares from different fossil fuel projects.
Yeah.
And that was instituted in 2016, the Nigerian Gas Commercialization, Flare Commercialization Program. And that is supposed to commercialize gas, which can then enable Nigeria to use it for its domestic uses, like when you hear about LPG, used for cooking, CNG, etc. But unfortunately, that process has not taken forth, has not taken roots. That was 2016. You now have in 2023 of September, the government announcing that it has awarded licenses to bidders to take up the gas that is commercialized. So there is some delay. Again, as I said earlier on, there is a context shift in terms of that. What is different now than what before is obviously we have the Petroleum Industry Act, which was passed in 2021, which then created a fiscal and regulatory framework to address the gas issues in Nigeria. So it provides a framework for financing and fiscalizing gas, and also creating a regulator, that is the Nigerian Midstream Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, to regulate the activities of that space. This is certainly a positive step that was taken, and you have seen again the NUPRS, as I said, which is the upstream regulator, announce this gas commercialization program. The question is whether or not is it too late for that process, and can we have the same ambitions that we had before? Should we be more realistic in terms of how we're moving forward, given that we don't have the revenues that we would need to harness these resources? Nigeria's Decade of Gas is looking at a focus on domestic gas utilization, but also exports. Within that framework, you have our export trade partners now transitioning from fossil fuels to other resources. So the market is shrinking. To develop the infrastructure in Nigeria, you require a lot of investments. You have a $20 billion deficit with infrastructure. Apparently, that's what we need every year. And this was announced by the former Minister of Petroleum Resources, Timothy Silva. And in the meantime, you have a $10 billion a year ticket or estimate that has also been put out to achieve energy transition. So the question is, how are we being realistic in terms of our plans? How are we making sure that everything is speaking to each other, both from a regulatory and a legal standpoint, but also from a policy standpoint, to make sure that we're all moving in one direction, and we can actually achieve the goals that we set for ourselves, given that we did not achieve what we set out in the Gas Master Plan 2008, the gas policy of 2017, and now we have the decade of gas. We have to be realistic in the ambitions that we have and make sure that we have the infrastructure. And where we don't, let us be realistic about our energy sources. If we cannot achieve it through gas only, we can also combine that with renewables, as we already set an ambition to achieve net zero and a just energy transition by 2060.
Capital, it seems to be capital intensive. Let's talk about this. Funding is something that is very important, and you have to make this attractive for investors to want to come in. So I know you monitor all of these processes, but what do you make of making gas reserves, both proven and unproven, become as attractive as expected? Because sometimes we have that issue, that big issue of also non-cost reflective pricing regime comes in, just like we had with electricity. How does this come to you?
Again, there have been challenges there. The government has made some moves to make the reflect more price reflective terms around its gas. But we have seen over time that exports have been a lot more attractive to partners than it is, for domestic uses. And that is still a bit of a challenge, which the government is trying to contend with. So it's about the government making sure that it is trying to expand its CNG uses for gas or LPG, that we have stations in place for that effort, because you also have to have the customers being able to use the resources that are being produced, right? So if you have suppliers of these products coming on stream, you want them to come on stream, they also have to have demand. They have to have people able to transition, to leverage these resources that are being produced, right? So you have CNG for transportation, but you don't have enough of stations that provide CNG. You don't have people converting their oil, petroleum cars to gas, right? So it's about being realistic in how we're trying to approach these sorts of plans that we have put in place.
All right, let me also follow up with some issues around host community conflicts, which we should not take away. But before we also go there, you had a very big event sometime, I think last week, and it's also very important because I read through strengthening maintain emissions reduction strategies in Nigeria's gas expansion project. Now, can you tell us more about this potential rise in methane emissions and what it means for climate change and all?
Thank you. Yeah, it's very important because as Nigeria is seeking to expand its gas uses domestically and exports, there are very huge implications for that. One is in terms of its environmental issues that come out of that. You have the gas flaring, again, which the gas commercial program is supposed to solve, but again, that is still not moving as fast as we would like. You also have the venting, fugitives, so leaks from pipelines, etc. And that has to be tempered, because if Nigeria is saying that it wants to reduce its emissions to achieve net zero by 2060, it has to make sure that its plans in the immediate are actually also speaking to those efforts. Government has said that they're doing a lot, but they have not revealed specific details in terms of how that is managed. You also have people that are living, speaking about the host communities, living in those regions, right, who are affected by these emissions. And then you have Nigeria making commitments globally as part of its nationally determined contributions to reduce emissions, say, for glass flaring by 2030, also in its energy transition plan, reducing fugitives by 60% by 2031, How do we achieve those sorts of goals? Again, another problem with that, we've noticed that it's difficult tracking progress for Nigeria because we don't have a strong enough baseline to determine where we are at this point and how we want to get there, right? So as Nigeria is making any plans that it's making, we're advocating that it should be very mindful of the implications of those plans on its global commitments and also its commitments to its citizens. Another implication of methane emissions is that the world is having, the world is actually having more stringent regulations when it comes to importing fossil fuel fuel products. Again, because of these commitments that all countries are making. One of our our top partners, our top trade partners, the EU, which imports about 60% of Nigeria's petroleum products and its gas, has been putting in very stringent regulations that require strong monitoring, verification, and reporting standards when it comes to our emissions before they will import products from outside of the country. By 2027, in fact, they have regulations that are coming on stream that will impede countries that are high emitting from importing their products into, exporting their products into the EU. So again, another reason why Nigeria has to be very mindful of the methane emissions that it is releasing into the atmosphere, its commitments globally, its commitment nationally, and then also its capacity to actually raise revenue and sell its products outside of its shores that it needs to achieve development and also to achieve its energy transition goals.
Very good. The NLNG story is something that many like to talk about when you talk about the gas environment or the gas value chain, market value chain. What sort of how do I put it, a policy initiative do you expect moving forward, and how can we have those kind of initiatives that will really pay out positively for exploring the gas reserves available in this country?
Yes, again, so very good question. And I'll surmise by saying that one, I mentioned the baseline study. Two, we need collaboration across all the different agencies, institutions that are working on these issues to create a holistic methane emissions framework. The NUPRC, that's the upstream regulator, has guidelines and regulations that speak to fugitives, gas flaring. We don't have a commensurate sort of efforts at the midstream and the downstream components. Again, they don't contribute as much, but there is still an important sort of space that also presents. Then we need very stringent regulations for the companies as well to adhere to make sure that they're able to help Nigeria actually to meet its targets and reduce its methane as well. We need more disclosures in terms of where Nigeria is in its emissions, as well as emissions profiles. We need a strong civil society actually to be part of these processes as well to monitor the progress that Nigeria is making or otherwise, or put pressure, in fact, on the companies to be able to adhere to their commitments. Outside Nigeria, there are very strong standards that these companies are signed up to and adhere to. But in Nigeria, there is no framework to monitor whether or not they are living up to those obligations. And so that is something that we also think is important for Nigeria to put in place.
At the end of the day, it's expected that this will also help to improve industrialization and all of that. Let me ask you also a question around the CNG drive of government, particularly at this time where we are talking about the fallout of subsidy removal, hike on the price of PMS. Many are also saying the other route to look at is CNG. So we're not looking at CNG powered vehicles and all of that. But I want to ask you, you're a player in this industry, and what do you make of this drive, and what do you think will be the outcome at the end of the day?
As I've stated throughout this interview, this is not the first time the government has had an ambition. It sets different targets for itself. Yeah. Whether or not they're realistic and achievable is a different question entirely. Again, there's a huge infrastructure deficit that needs to be filled if the government actually wants to go into those efforts. You need to get the gas out of the ground as well. You have associated gas as well, which is reducing, and there are implications. That means that we have less gas. So the gas conversion program also has to come on stream. There are so many more questions than there are answers, honestly. And so the government has to put a realistic and honest effort behind whatever plans that it makes, bearing in mind that it also has this commitment to transition fully to renewables, etc. So we have to keep our long-term goals in mind as well as our short-term goals and make realistic plans, whether it be CNG for transport, LPG for cooking, or other uses for industrialization. The plans have to be realistic. We have to look at the finances that we have, the infrastructure that we have, and make decisions and choose not the resource doggedly, but energy instead. So whatever we can use to achieve it, renewables, gas, let's make those plans realistic and fit our long-term goals and commitments.
As much as possible. Again, you know, this thing, renewables are not even cheap when you talk of it. And many will say they want some government need to come in one way, incentivize some of these particular products and all of that to make Nigerians adopt more of it. But what's your outlook for the entire industry and what more should we be expecting from your institute moving forward?
Thank you. NRGI, Natural Resource Governance Institute, is committed to supporting governments, citizens to understand the implications of these resources on their lives, on government plans to achieve realistic goals that benefit them. We have a number of different products. Everything I've talked about today, we have products on our website. We have a guidebook on Nigeria's energy transition. So you can learn everything about what the transition fuel means for Nigeria, what the implications are, what Nigeria should be mindful of, what you as citizens should prioritize. We have more content on a briefing notes that we developed as well on the methane emissions too and right sizing of gas. So all of those details and information are available to you if you visit our website, resourcegovernance.org. To find more information. And also, you can also reach out to me on platforms as well through our website. So thank you so much for this platform.
This afternoon, Tengi George Okoli. Ikoli, she is the senior officer with Natural Resource Governance Institute. Thank you so much for joining the program. Do enjoy your day.
Thank you for having me. You too.
All right then.